Welcome to everyone for the second day of this, what's turning out to be a fascinating conference, I think. We have our art history session this morning, which I've been looking forward to very much. So I'd like to introduce you to our chair for this session, Chriscinda Henry, who is Assistant Professor of Art History at McGill University. She's currently here at ITATI, where she's working on the visual culture of the Carnival in Florence and Rome under the Medici. She's here on one of the fellowships, the Hannah Keel Fellowship. She received her MA from Columbia University and her PhD from Chicago. And she has contributed to a number of journals, including Renaissance Studies, Italian Studies, Journal of the History of Collection. She's also contributed to some fascinating sounding collections of essays, playthings in early modernity, party games, word games, mind games, which came out with the Medieval Institute Press in 2017, just this year, and perhaps even more intriguing, sex acts in early modern Italy, practice, performance, perversion, punishment, which has to be one of the best
titles. Same editor, both titles.
Oh, fantastic. So you're responsible for the title.
No, the editor.
And that came out in 2010. How have I missed it so far? So I'll hand her over for the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Virginia, and for the invitation to chair the session. I'm really excited for today's art history session, especially after yesterday, when a lot of sort of complex and contradictory, or potentially contradictory issues came up involving the sort of blending of spiritual care and erotic desire, and the contrast between sort of evocative synesthetic language in Vittoria Colonna's letters and her mortification of the flesh and denial of sensible flesh. So I think a lot of these issues are very pertinent for the very tightly focused and related talks that we have today in art history, as well as sort of bringing out some of the other issues that came up. I was really fascinated in thinking about sort of actors and networks yesterday, and the idea of access, proximity, both physical and material, and agency through objects circulating in networks. And so I think we're going to have some more fascinating contributions to those issues today. So let me introduce our first speaker, Jessica Maratsos, who is Assistant Professor in Art History and Fine Arts at the American University in Paris, having received her PhD in Art History from Columbia University in 2014. Her research focuses on the intersection of religious traditions and pictorial innovation in Renaissance Italy, with a particular emphasis on the parallels between theology and Cinquecento art theory, which was something that was much on my mind yesterday when we were talking about the letters and sonnets. She has a forthcoming article on Pontormo's Capponi Chapel in art history, as well as an article forthcoming in the Art Bulletin entitled Michelangelo, Vittoria Colonna, and the Afterlife of Intimacy. And she's working on a book on the Florentine painter Jacopo Pontormo. And the title of her talk today is One Such Spark, Vittoria Colonna, Michelangelo, and the Dissemination of Devotion.
I would like to be the first to chime in again today to thank Virginia and everyone else for having made this conference possible and for the fantastic papers that we've already had and that I look forward to hearing this afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone. Michelangelo and Vittoria Colonna shared one of the most famous friendships in the Renaissance. While they were individually heralded by contemporaries as divine, their rapport resulted in sonnets and presentation drawings that represented some of the era's most refined aesthetic meditations on the intersection of literature, art, and devotion. Privately conceived and shared, these objects were not a part of the traditional institutions of Catholic patronage. Rather, the intimacy embedded in the very structure of the sonnets and drawings reinforced the primacy of personal contemplation and exchange as critical features within the Italian evangelicals known as the spirituali. Yet this picture, in which there is a strict correspondence between the objects and their audience, is complicated by the fact that these artistic creations did not remain exclusive to their originators and recipients. As the recent exhibition D'Apres Michelangelo held at the Castello Sforzesco in Milan amply demonstrates, as well as the earlier catalog by Charles de Tolnay, and here are just two images from the catalog. Michelangelo's presentation drawings, including those made originally for Colonna, were widely copied during the 16th century in an incredible range of media, from chalk, paint, and print, to bronze, marble, and rock crystal. Colonna's sonnets as well were extensively circulated, as we all know. Between 1538 until her death in 1547, 13 editions of her Rimme were printed, none of which with her express permission or approval. My paper today aims to explore how certain painted copies of the drawings operated within ever-expanding spheres of dissemination. Critical to this investigation are the ways in which questions regarding audience, medium, and function raised by these copies are bound up with broader issues of authenticity and originality as understood within Cinquecento culture. Despite their fame and the fascination they exercised over the minds of their peers, much of the relationship between the poet and artist remains tantalizingly elusive. It is uncertain, for example, precisely what year they met, most likely either in 1536 or 1538, and of their extensive correspondence, only 7 letters are extant, 2 by Michelangelo and 5 by Colonna, none of which bears a date, and the order in which they were sent is unclear. Additionally, while Colonna's letters are discrete, self-contained objects, those we know this is already sort of a question of circulation in itself, the 2 by Michelangelo are known only in draft form. One housed in the Biblioteca Archivio Vaticano is written at the top of a sheet that also contains a draft of the sonnet Oren su l'uno destro, oren su l'altro manco piede, written at a 90-degree angle to the letter. The second, in the Casa Buonarroti, appears twice on a single sheet, below 2 versions of the sonnet Per esser manco alta signora indegno. One version of each is in the hand of Michelangelo, while the others are in that of Donato Gianotti, whose transcription proposes variations on the sonnet. The presence of another hand points to the ways in which the relationship between Colonna and Michelangelo, even at its most essential level, existed in a network of exchange wherein communication was always already indirect, subject as it was to mediation and replication. Similar complications regarding the notion of originality and circulation apply as well to the precious gifts exchanged by the 2 friends, including to extant drawings by Michelangelo, the Christ on the Cross at the British Museum, and the Pietà at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and a manuscript collection of 103 sonnets by Colonna, Vaticano Latino 11539. As has been well established in previous scholarship, and as everyone here well knows, Colonna's innovative engagement with the Petrarchan sonnet form, resulting in a new genre known as rimme spirituali, was inextricably connected to her involvement with such evangelicals as Juan de Valdez and Cardinal Reginald Pole, about whom we heard quite a bit yesterday. Regarding the drawings, Alexander Nagel has persuasively explored the ways in which the analogy of God's grace invoked in these works was linked to the broader dialogue surrounding the concept of sola fide, taking place within the same evangelical milieu. Additional significant parallels between presentation drawings and sonnets have been pointed out by Leonard Barkin, who characterized these genres as, quote, acts of introspection transferred into privacy à deux. On its face, the Petrarchan sonnet is explicitly self-reflexive, tracing the poet's intellectual and emotional examination of her own soul, yet the deliberate refinement of self that is at stake is conceptualized in relation to an ideal other who can serve simultaneously as the poet's model and addressee. The first-person voice of the sonnet invites the reader to enter into this dialogic structure, experiencing the poet's revelations as his own. The intimate language is much more immediate than the narrative rhythm of the epic and engendered the participatory immersion of the reader, just as Michelangelo's drawings compelled the viewer to engage in a different, more personal aesthetic experience than that engendered by monumental altarpiece. Of the 2 gift drawings created for Colonna, the Christ on the Cross in the British Museum is better preserved and therefore offers a clearer illustration of the sophistication of Michelangelo's execution. Perfectly centered along the vertical axis, the upright beam of the cross in this image extends from the bare earth, marked by a single skull at the bottom of the page, and is cut off at the top edge. The horizontal arms terminate just before the edges of the sheet. This simple structure organizes the composition and provides ostensible support for Christ's body that is its focus. Yet this drawing does not portray Christ hanging limp and dead from the cross. Rather, his form is powerfully conceived as he strains against the nails that affix him to the wood. His arms are extended rigidly to the sides, while his torso spirals upward in a sensuous curve. On either side, he is framed by a single mourning angel that is only lightly sketched, seeming barely to take shape as it emerges from a cloudy background. The contrast between these figures and the highly detailed musculature of Christ only reiterates the primacy of his bodily sacrifice and simultaneously underscores the incredible facility and delicacy of Michelangelo's execution. The skillfully modulated shifts from shadow to highlight soften the tension of his musculature, and his flesh is rendered with such subtle touches of chalk that it attains an almost sensual appeal. Dramatic shading is used to great effect in the expression, emphasizing the imploring gaze that Christ directs upward in an ecstatic twist that may have deliberately evoked the Laocoon. These features demanded close, intimate looking, and Colonna famously described examining the Christ on the cross, quote, carefully in the light and with a lens and a mirror, but even so admitting that, quote, certainly I could never explain how subtly and miraculously it is made. The connection implied here between aesthetic appreciation and divine revelation is explored more fully in another letter from Colonna to Michelangelo, in which she writes, «Gli effetti vostri eccitano a forza il giudizio di chi li guarda, e ho visto che omnia possibilia sunt credunti», which might be translated as, your effects forcibly awaken the judgment of whoever looks at them, and I have seen that all things are possible to those who believe. As Nagel has pointed out, the immediate transition from visual description to theological pronouncement, and the switch from the Italian to the Latin, of course, emphasizes this, is novel, highlighting the ways in which Colonna's letter, quote, invokes the trial of faith in describing the hermeneutic challenges of a work of art that also tests the viewer's capacity to believe and understand. The appreciation of Michelangelo's drawings entailed intensive religious introspection, an experience that is complicated when one tries to define the ways in which these objects were often circulated within a larger but still private coterie, to which we will now turn. In a well-known letter dated 12 May 1546, Pietro Bertano, Bishop of Fano, wrote to Cardinal Gonzaga, quote, Monsieur Paul has learned that you would like a Christ by the hand of Michelangelo, and has asked me to confirm discreetly whether this is so, because if indeed it is, he has one by the master's hand that he would gladly send to you, but it is in the form of a Pietà, even though the whole body is shown. He says this would not be a loss to him, as he can obtain another from the Marchioness of Pescara. Gonzaga's response was immediate, clarifying that he did not wish to deprive the cardinal of this work for long, but only the time necessary for him to arrange for Messer Giulio Romano to copy it and then return it to you. These letters simultaneously illuminate certain mechanisms of exchange within this group, while raising even further questions regarding the nature of copies versus originals. And it should be acknowledged here that the work under discussion in the letters is not extant, and that this Marcello Venusti painting offers another specific insight into the nature of copying that I'll explore in just a few minutes, but it is also lovely to have it to look at as we imagine this sort of exchange in letters. Of note is the fact that Gonzaga's desire to have a work by Michelangelo can be fulfilled by a copy, executed by his faithful court artist, Giulio Romano. This attitude stands in stark contrast to Colonna's own demand, voiced in another letter to Michelangelo, to know that the work she receives is by the master's hand alone, and may indicate the relative position of the two, Colonna and Gonzaga, within the spheres that such objects circulated. The nature of the gift could be diluted as it passed from one hand to another. Yet Bertano's desire to confirm the cardinal's wishes discreetly seems to indicate that this exchange was still conducted under the aegis of secrecy that sometimes pertained to those within a restricted inner circle of religious intimacy. In this way, while the copy would not satisfy Colonna, it could have served as a memento of this network of friendship for Gonzaga. Just as objects in the Renaissance studiolo, including portraits, medals, and antique gems, reinforced the connections of sociability embodied in the letters that would be written and kept in such a setting, so too might a copy like that commissioned by Gonzaga fulfill the same function. From the mid-1530s, Colonna and Gonzaga corresponded on the state of church reform. In particular, the Marchesa successfully petitioned for the cardinal's aid in supporting Bernardino Ochino and his recently founded order of Capuchins, and it is possible that through their friendship, Gonzaga became privy to the ways in which Michelangelo's drawings were simultaneously inspired by and helped to stimulate Colonna's own spiritual writing. In this regard, it is worth noting that Pietro Bertano, who wrote to Gonzaga offering the Pietà in Reginald Pole's possession, had served as Gonzaga's own theological tutor almost 10 years earlier. Over the course of the year 1537, Gonzaga admitted in letters to Cardinal Gasparo Contarini that despite frequent lessons with Bertano on the epistles of St. Paul, he found he understood less and less with time. Unfortunately, having reached, by January of 1538, Romans chapter 11 in these studies. The centrality of Paul's writings to the concept of sola fide cannot be overstated, and the chapter to which Gonzaga referred is no exception. In commenting on the fate of the Israelites, Paul wrote, quote, "So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace." Gonzaga's grappling with sola fide, an essential yet hotly debated tenet of spirituale belief, might be seen to mirror similar religious struggles undertaken by both Colonna and Michelangelo and made manifest in their poetry and drawings. For the Mantuan cardinal, then, his copy of the Pietà could have served a multiplicity of functions, as a token of friendship, as an independent work of art, and as a provocation to devotional contemplation. By considering the broader religious panorama, there also exists the suggestive possibility that the copy itself, when executed under the proper conditions, was able to capture some of the sacred aura of the original. Recently, Elena Cavillo has demonstrated that such an understanding of the copy's vestigial power, which had been traditionally applied to the reproduction of icons, was, at this moment, invoked by Giulio Clovio and Sebastiano del Piombo in works they executed after originals by Michelangelo. That this notion would have been applied more broadly to copies after the master is hinted at by Vasari when he recalled in the Lives that, quote, Messer Tommaso de Cavalieri obtained a good number miraculous things which Michelangelo once drew for Fra Sebastiano Veneziano, and in truth he rightly treasured them as relics. The potency of this metaphor, the explicit link made between drawing and relic, is directly related to the practice of copying when Vasari immediately continues, and he has courteously given craftsmen access to them, the drawings, for the purposes of studying and copying. Similarly, Colonna's enthusiastic admiration for both the sophisticated art of Michelangelo and the simplicity of earlier icons placed the dialogue between these disparate types of religious imagery at the center of their friendship. In the letter describing her engagement with the Christ on the cross, she begins by exclaiming that she had, quote, examined the crucifixion, which is certainly crucified in my mind all other pictures I have ever seen, nor could one find another more beautifully made, more alive, and more finished image. In her gift manuscript for Michelangelo, however, she included a sonnet that lauds an icon painted by St. Luke for precisely opposite attributes. And here's the most famous St. Luke icon in Rome. Describing St. Luke's endeavor, quote, "He mustered all possible skill to render true to life that sweet, holy countenance. But his breast was so full of the immensity of his concept that, like a vase overfilled with water that cannot easily flow out, the great design came forth bit by bit, partial and imperfect. Some shade of her sweet and grave air was captured, yet she is not lifelike, perhaps because he scorned the polished lights and haughty shades of artifice." Colonna cannot imagine a Christ more alive than that by Michelangelo, whereas the image by St. Luke, which is specifically described and lacking this quality, is able, through its simplicity, to excite the viewer's devotional imagination to transcend the bounds of earthly contemplation. Yet she also believed that the aesthetic qualities of Michelangelo's drawings were similarly capable of stimulating the viewer's spiritual judgment and could serve as appropriate aids in meditation. In her letter to Michelangelo that began lauding Gli affetti vostri, Colonna concluded by writing, "And in this way, I do not know how else to serve you than to pray to this sweet Christ that you have so well and perfectly painted." Further evidence of the preoccupation with these intersecting concepts of the image in Michelangelo's circle is found in the third Roman dialogue penned by Francisco de Olanda as part of his artistic treatise De Pintura Antigua. A Portuguese courtier, humanist, and miniaturist, de Olanda visited Rome from 1538 to 1541, during which time he made the acquaintance of Michelangelo and numerous other artistic and intellectual luminaries. While the degree to which de Olanda accurately depicts the views of these two interlocutors remains problematic, given that here he is referring to a commission he himself fulfilled, copying the Holy Face housed in the Lateran Sancta Sanctorum for the Queen of Portugal, the artistic aims and challenges Olanda described in such an undertaking are worthy of consideration. When questioned regarding his process, he states that, quote, "I employed my whole skill not to add or subtract anything as regards that grave austerity." The difficulty in maintaining the aura of the original, that, quote, "severity in the eyes, such as would naturally become the Savior," was purportedly acknowledged by Michelangelo himself, who not only attributed this ability to the artist's skill, but also to his possession of divinely inspired grace and wisdom. In de Olanda's dialogue, he is given to state, quote, "And in the Old Testament, it was the will of God the Father that those who had merely to adorn and paint the Ark of the Covenant should not only be great and eminent masters, but should also be inspired with his grace and wisdom. How much more so must it be his will that care and judgment should be bestowed on copying his serene countenance and that of his Son, our Lord. As we all know, and Messer Francisco better than any, for badly wrought images distract the attention and prevent devotion. The artist who was to copy such a venerable image had to be morally and artistically worthy of such a task, and the same, it could be argued, was also true of an artist who would copy a work by the divine hand of Michelangelo. With this type of replication as a possible model, it is clear that an object that merely recorded the invenzione of the master would not necessarily fulfill the many demands that could be placed upon a copy. Indeed, Gonzaga could have easily obtained a print after the Pietà by Giulio Bonassone, which is the most faithful rendering of the original created in this reproductive medium. But Gonzaga pursued an individually crafted work by a great master instead. The cardinal's preference for a painting over a print, a medium whose very production thematized the notion of the copy in very specific terms, is inextricably linked to concerns raised by the following question. In what sense was the Michelangelo offered by Bertano in the first place unoriginal. The bishop's claim that Pole can easily acquire another from Colonna is striking, given the notorious difficulties even the most powerful patrons had in obtaining anything by the master's own hand. Nor is any work for the cardinal mentioned by either Condivi or Vasari. Rather, it seems more likely that this Pietà, like Gonzaga's subsequent commission, was a work that fulfilled the role of an original without being executed by Michelangelo, but instead by someone close to and worthy of the master. Gonzaga's terminology may point in this direction as well, for in his response to Bertano, he refers to the work repeatedly as un quadro. This is complicated, however, by Colonna's own description of the Christ that excites her judgment as dipinto. This confusion of vocabulary has led to proposals that Michelangelo's works for Colonna were in fact paintings, or that he executed paintings for Pole and possibly others, now found in various collections in Europe and the United States. The arguments for this former ignore the compelling descriptions provided by both Condivi and Vasari, who would have been unlikely to make such an error in identifying the medium, while the identification of the paintings as by Michelangelo's own hand continued to be, let's just say, problematic for the moment. Perhaps more plausible is the interpretation that painted copies, of which a number are extant, were made for close associates like Pole and Gonzaga, while Colonna's use of the term dipinta, as well as describing the drawings as finita, relates more directly to her poetic understanding of these concepts within the framework of 16th century devotional language. This last point has been convincingly elucidated by Una Romandelia, whose analysis draws out the paradoxical relationship between disegno and colorito as employed by Colonna in her poetry. In discussing the drawings, she notes that they are characterized by an exceptional degree of sensual modeling and refined finish that would have been read by Colonna as, quote, a carefully crafted colorito. From Cinquecento art historical treatises, it is clear that the deployment of light and shade, as opposed to hue, was a point of contention, and that this aspect of chiaroscuro modeling was given by some authors to disegno, and by others to colorito. More immediately, the juxtaposition of these terms is employed by Colonna in her poetry as a means of articulating a rift between the intellectual understanding of Christ's grace and the more sensible comprehension of his sacrifice for and love of humanity. It is difficult to imagine how a copyist, even one who is particularly skilled, would be able to evoke these tensions exquisitely embodied in the original drawings. By rendering Michelangelo's invention in oil, the worthy artist would not have to compete with, and ultimately fall short of, the master draftsman, and he would be able to emulate the almost coloristic effects that Michelangelo created through his subtle application of chalk. Of the many copies after Michelangelo's gift drawings that have been identified, some of the most refined are paintings attributed to Marcello Venusti. While the relationship between Venusti and Michelangelo has been traditionally dated to the late 1540s, a letter written in 1542 by Nino Cernini to none other than Cardinal Ercole Gonzaga recounts, quote, a young Mantuan, that one who is painting the new work in the chapel by Michelangelo, and Curtio told me that Michelangelo lauds him highly, him referring to Venusti. Taken in conjunction with Vasari's assertion that, quote, with designs by Michelangelo and after his works, he, Venusti, made an infinite number of similar small items. It seems reasonable to posit that Venusti executed paintings after the gift drawings in the early 1540s with the approval of the master himself. This hypothesis is further supported by the fact that in Venusti's copies after the crucifixion, the figures of John the Evangelist and the Virgin that he incorporated were also based on drawings by Michelangelo, to which he would have had access in the master's studio. And it should be noted that recent technical analysis of the Venusti crucifixion here owned by Campion Hall, supports the hypothesis that this work was done by Venusti from Michelangelo drawings. Indeed, it is precisely this kind of close relationship in which the older and notoriously difficult Michelangelo valued the artistic skill and moral character of the younger artist that we can imagine could have produced images that contemporaries would have valued as truly efficacious copies that preserved the aura of the originals. In closing, I would like to suggest that the collaboration between an author and her amanuensis may be profitably compared in some ways to that between Michelangelo and Venusti, as outlined here. Not, it should be stated, to assert that visual and textual copying are inherently the same, but rather to point out, or rather to re-emphasize points that have already been made by many here in this room, the ways in which an author like Colonna might work with others to simultaneously disseminate and control her poetic production. It is precisely this kind of control manifested in the careful selection, ordering, and editing of works that Abigail Brundin has highlighted as critical in two of the manuscript collections of Colonna's writings, Vaticano Latino 11539, prepared for Michelangelo, and Ashburnham 1153, likely prepared for Marguerite of Navarre. I will not go into detail here. And indeed, I understand that we may hear more on Colonna's manuscripts and readership this afternoon, but I would just like to point to two specific ways in which Colonna acknowledged the concept of circulation in her manuscript for Michelangelo, which was written in the hand of her personal scribe. First, as Professor Brundin has noted, Colonna made slight yet significant changes in the sonnet that opens this collection. In a different version of the poem, which was then later published by Valgrisi in the 1546 edition of the Rime, Colonna had written, quote, "so that I may write down for myself all that he suffered," while in the Michelangelo manuscript she has changed this to, quote, "so that I may write down for others all that he has suffered." This slight shift signals the altered function of the sonnet. No longer is it a tool for interior contemplation alone, but it has become a vehicle for shared devotional experience. The still limited nature of that sharing, however, is made clear in the second-to-last sonnet included in the Michelangelo manuscript. Here Colonna excuses the fact that she rarely polishes the roughness of her verses. Quote, "This is because my primary concern is not to garner praise for it, or to avoid contempt, or that, after my joyful return to heaven, my poems will live on in the world more highly honored, but the divine fire, which through its mercy inflames my mind, sometimes gives out these sparks of its own accord, and if one such spark should once warm some gentle heart, then 1,000 times 1,000 thanks I owe to that happy mistake." Colonna's aspirations appear modest. To share these sparks of divine warmth with a single heart is perhaps sufficient. Yet in a letter from 1551 to his nephew, Michelangelo himself admits to having shared these sonnets with others years earlier, thus allowing her message to circulate beyond the confines of their friendship. Indeed, in 1551, he seems to feel responsible for subsequent publication of her poetry. Quote, "At that time I lent them," the sonnets, "to many people, so they are all in print." Unfortunately, the narrative of Colonna and Michelangelo in print is entirely too complex to elucidate here, but I would like to suggest that while print could be argued to promote codification and simplification, and many of the prints after Michelangelo's drawings clearly bring them in line with Counter-Reformation dictates, the very changes manifested by the different editions of Colonna's sonnets and Michelangelo's drawings could argue precisely the opposite. This mode of dissemination could encourage a multiplicity of viewing, reading, and interpreting. The function of the image or the sonnet could change to instantiate new concepts of originality. Ultimately, however, for those closest to Michelangelo and Colonna, the question of authenticity was intrinsically more personally inflected. As friends of the artist and poet, they sought to preserve the complex layers of intimacy these relationships entailed through the creation and exchange of individually produced objects that continued to challenge and to delight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for that very rich paper. My pleasure now to introduce Christopher Nygren, who received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 2011 and is assistant professor in history of art and architecture at the University of Pittsburgh and teaches on late medieval and early modern Italian art and Iberian art. He's published in a range of journals from MLN, Renaissance Quarterly, and the Art Bulletin. And I'm particularly looking forward to the forthcoming chapter in Presence and Agency, Rhetoric, Aesthetics, and the Experience of Art, which is forthcoming, and Renaissance paintings on stone.
Limits of pictorial devotion.
Yes, Titian, Colonna, and the Limits of Pictorial Devotion.
Thank you all very much. Thank you so much to the organizers and to all of the participants. I made some frantic changes to the paper last night, which you will see. As happens at these sorts of intense two-day conferences, what happens on the first day really impacts what happens on the second. So I look forward to the continued conversation. So what does a devotional picture look like? This is a line of inquiry that seems straightforward, but I will assert that it is only deceptively so. This paper will wrestle with that question by examining the figure of Vittoria Colonna and her relationship with Titian. Around 1531, Titian produced this painting, or a painting very much like it, for Vittoria Colonna. We will dwell with this painting. My aim in doing so is threefold. First, I want to clarify a few important points regarding the relationship between Titian and Colonna. Recently, scholars have gravitated toward understanding Colonna as a patron in the exchange with Titian. However, closely reading documentary records against contemporary commissions that Titian undertook in the 1530s shows that this is not a simple case of art patronage. Second, I want to examine our understanding of what devotional pictures looked like in the middle of the 16th century. Numerous scholars have taken issue with Titian's painting for Vittoria Colonna, suggesting that it is little more than, quote, thinly veiled pornography, end quote. I resist this secularizing assessment of Titian's painting. The third and final movement of this paper will be to convince you that my resistance is warranted by examining Titian's paintings within the context of female spirituality in early 16th century northern Italy. This will allow us to circle back and reconsider what were the salient features of devotional images produced for women in this period. Does Titian's picture align with or deviate from those norms? But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let me begin with a clarification. The first line of my abstract reads, quote, scholars generally agree that Titian's painting of Mary Magdalene, now in the Palazzo Pitti, was painted for Vittoria Colonna, end quote. Now, this is not untrue. However, the term generally is doing a lot of work here. Such is the nature of an abstract. Consensus, of course, is a fuzzy term. If we are to take percentages as a relative proxy for consensus, somewhere north of 50% of scholars who have published on the Magdalene accept that it is likely the picture that was given to Vittoria Colonna. But consensus, of course, does not mean unanimity. A large and vocal minority of scholars vehemently resist this assertion. They argue that the Pitti painting is a later variant of the picture given to Vittoria Colonna. The Pitti painting, on this account, was probably made for a member of the Gonzaga family. Now, it must be admitted that there is some uncertainty as to how Colonna's picture would have made it into the Medici collection. There is circumstantial evidence suggesting that Colonna may have gifted the picture to Eleonora Gonzaga, who in turn may have passed it to her son, Duke Guidobaldo II della Rovere. And indeed, Vasari saw a painting of the Magdalene by Titian in Duke Guidobaldo's guardaroba. That is the same room where he saw the Venus of Urbino in 1548. However, it must be admitted that this is all conjecture, and those scholars who believe that the Pitti painting was made for Vittoria acknowledge that there is ambiguity in the documentary record. Yet I think that there is good evidence in the picture itself to suggest that Vittoria was the intended recipient. We shall get to that in time. Let the assertion remain provisional for now. Marjorie Ock has done a masterful job making available the documents related to this picture. I will not go through all of the documents here. They are copious and readily available in modern transcriptions. I will limit my discussion to a few points that have important ramifications for the argument that I'll develop moving forward. Ock has been particularly forceful in her assertion that Vittoria Colonna engaged Titian as a patron. I disagree with this reading. The opening letter from Federico Gonzaga to Titian makes fairly clear the nature of this relationship. Gonzaga approached Titian and hoped to gain from him a picture that he could present to Vittoria as a gift. Let us cite the letter sent from Gonzaga to Titian on the 5th of March, 1531. Quote, "I would like you to make me a St. Mary Magdalene as lachrymose as possible in a painting the same size as the one of St. Jerome, or 2 fingers larger, and that you make every effort to make it beautiful, which for you will not be remarkable, as you cannot do otherwise, when you really want to." Some question about whether Titian always wants to or not. Also furnishing it promptly, another thing that Titian never did, because I wish to send it to be given to the most illustrious Lord Marchese del Guasto, and making it so that it appears an honorable gift being sent by me to a lord such as the Marchese, and above all, let me have it soon, reiterating, this is a guy who could occasionally take 20 years to produce a picture. Now, a few problems present themselves here. First of all, Gonzaga had told Titian that he'd be giving the painting to the Marchese del Vasto, not the Marchesa. By this letter, the painting is destined not for a female beholder, but for a male beholder of great stature. Now, a letter written by Gonzaga to Vittoria 1 week later makes clear that he was being evasive. The picture was clearly destined for her. Quote, "I have learned that you desire a beautiful painting by the hand of an excellent painter of the figure of St. Mary Magdalene, and immediately I sent to Venice and wrote to Titian, who is perhaps the most excellent painter to be found today in that art, and who is all mine." I'm sure, Charles V would have something to say about that. "Soliciting him with great promptness to execute a most beautiful one, as lachrymose as she can be, and to let me have it quickly. And I hope to have it here perhaps by Easter, and to have it sent to your ladyship," end quote. There is reason to believe that Titian learned through back channels of Gonzaga's desire to present the picture to Vittoria. However, Titian never had any direct interaction with Vittoria. Even when she wrote in gratitude for the painting, she sent her thanks to Gonzaga rather than to Titian. This is an important point, and I would suggest that it is essential to insist that this artistic affair unfolds in an indirect and circuitous fashion. Rather than think of Colonna as a patron, I would insist that we must reconfigure her role as a recipient in an act of indirect exchange. Far from divesting her of her agency, appreciating this fact fundamentally reformulates this entire incident. Rather than be a moment of artistic patronage, a titanic wrestling of 2 strong-headed personalities, Vittoria and Titian, this slides the entire episode into what Shira Brisman has in her recent study of Titian's contemporary, Albrecht Dürer, called the epistolary mode of artistic address. What Brisman means to identify with this cunning turn of phrase is the complicated concatenation of artistic, economic, and political agencies that generated the conditions of possibility in early modern art. Drawing on the social life of letters, Brisman's epistolary mode of artistic address is marked by an appeal from artist to viewer that is direct and intimate at the same time that it acknowledges the distance that defers its message. It leaves room for the unexpected detours that make up the social life of a work of art. Its successful delivery, or its being waylaid. Its ability to create a kinship of beholders that far exceeds its initial intent, or its potential for failure to communicate. As a category of analysis, the epistolary mode sensitizes us to the unique dispensation of early modern devotional pictures, which were meant to be intimate, missives directed to a public of one. Yet they clearly served a semi-public function as prestige objects. While the devotional image may address an individual, its message must be generalizable, perhaps even universalizable, if it is to discharge its function. Artists were acutely aware of the difficulty of producing such images. In analyzing works of art produced in the epistolary mode, the modern art historian becomes aware of the distance between the moment of making and the time of arrival. The gap that exists between the creative energy poured into the picture and the prolonged, repeated acts of viewing undertaken at a different time, in a different place, by a different person. Having spent the better part of a decade now working on Titian, I've become fairly familiar with his mode of operation and how he engaged patrons. Titian was particularly adept at negotiating the challenges of the epistolary mode, of making works of art that succeeded upon arrival in a place and time that was occluded from his view, a context made up of idiosyncratic social agents whose foibles were unknown to him and whose reaction he was challenged to anticipate. Titian's P.T. Magdalene is one of those missives, sent from Venice to Mantua, but ultimately bound for Ischia, a place that Titian never visited and had little incentive to understand. But Colonna's reputation preceded her. Titian produced a devotional picture that was, within the parameters of the epistolary mode of address, a bespoke icon. How did her will become clear? How did Titian meet that charge? That will become clear as well. But first, we must pause for a moment to consider the category of picture that he was charged with producing. Titian received very little instruction from Federico Gonzaga. He was given a subject, Magdalene, a size, about the same size as Jerome, a generic request for quality, make it beautiful, and a timeline, as quickly as possible. The only thing that stands out in Gonzaga's charge to Titian is his descriptor of the subject. Make it as lachrymose as possible. We shall return to this point, but if we take these things as Gonzaga's charge, Magdalene, beautiful, quickly, lachrymose, Titian's pictorial brief nevertheless surprises us for the way in which it discharges these expectations. Titian's picture is a peculiar pictorial object, an unexpected, unpredicted response to a charge that he had received. Titian mustered an array of pictorial resources to produce a response that, it is important to remember, did not yet exist. In retrospect, and in light of the numerous iterations of this subject that Titian painted over subsequent decades, this picture may seem an imminently foreseeable response to Gonzaga's charge. But it was not. And this is where scholars have been stymied for over a generation. How does this picture align with the category of devotional image? Now, the phrase devotional image may evoke something like this, or this, or this. These pictures all fit into an intuitive conception of what devotional pictures ought to look like. By focusing the beholder's attention on Christ's suffering, these pictures evoke a sense of contrition and compassion in the beholder. Operating according to a logic of mimetic identification between the subject inside the picture and the beholder outside of the picture, these paintings induce the faithful into a posture, a disposition of compassion, literally compassio, to suffer with. This is one approach to answering the question, what does a devotional picture look like? By this logic, devotional pictures are relatively straightforward, playing on the affective relationship between image and beholder. To call such paintings devotional pictures is not necessarily to suggest that we know a lot about their historical context of their display, or even their modes of use. Instead, it is largely focused on formal and iconographic cues, which, we suppose, offer insight into modes of use. As we press on this definition, the classificatory justification for considering these images devotional pictures becomes more and more problematic. Must all devotional pictures function in the same way? Certainly not. What do we expect from them? A spur to compassion? Imitation of an exemplary sanctified forebear? Didactic chastisement? Ethical stylization of the self? A prompt to conversion? All of these pictures can reasonably be said to support the work of devotion, yet they do so in distinct ways. There is no universal strategy. It is well known that the High Renaissance, however we choose to define it, brought about lasting changes in the artistic and representational economies of European art. Artists like Raphael and Michelangelo explored new modes of integrating classical aesthetics and learning into Christian images. However, in most accounts of early modern European art, one of the unintended collateral effects of the High Renaissance was a questioning of the validity of the idea of the devotional image. The Protestant Reformation and the episodes of iconoclasm that it initiated forced artists, even staunchly Catholic artists, into a defensive posture regarding the status of devotional pictures. Artists became increasingly aware of the limits of devotional paintings and the inadequacy of their own artistic creations when compared to the grace-giving, miracle-working images of previous generations. On this account, a rift opens between medieval devotional pictures, which worked, which were efficacious in some meaningful way, and early modern devotional pictures, which insist on their own inadequacy as conduits of divine grace. In the book manuscript that I've just completed, and a series of articles that I've already published, I've attempted to offer a different account of Renaissance devotional pictures. Currently titled Titian's Icons, Art, Theology, and Agency in Renaissance Italy, my study tries to divert attention away from traditional areas of scholarly focus. As I'm sure you're all aware, Titian is most famous for his naked ladies in mythological narratives, or his pyrotechnic altarpieces, or his amazing imperial portraits. These are all great, but when perusing Titian's vast corpus, I noticed that there were many devotional pictures that haven't been given much scholarly attention. This painting is perhaps the exception, because scholars have thought it worthy of serious scrutiny. And this is part of the reason that it appears only fleetingly in my book. However, the scholarship has tended to get stranded on the shoals of decorum. Many scholars have suggested that the 16th century was a period of increasingly defined genres. Now, this is evidently true in the realm of literature, as is evidenced by the vibrant debates about Aristotle's Poetics. Scholars have generally accepted that something similar was afoot in the realm of the visual arts, that there was an increasingly strong and recognizable distinction between sacred and secular. If such a thing as genre decorum exists, it raises a fundamental issue with many pictures produced around mid-century. By one logic, certain pictorial subjects, strategies, and modalities of portraying human, especially female bodies, risked abrogating whatever devotional function and overtly religious subject matter might have arrogated to a picture. Such thinking raises a number of fundamental questions. Was it possible to have a genuinely devotional image that so knowingly exhibits female flesh? Can a painting willfully, perhaps even gleefully, subvert the rules of decorum and still discharge its function as a devotional image? Do issues like eroticism continue to have salience if we take seriously that the painting was perhaps done for a female beholder? Many scholars have decided that Titian's picture of Mary Magdalene violated the rules of decorum. Now, one response to this is to see the painting as a sort of wry and ironic commentary on the collision of genres, as the devotional picture rubs up against the category of delectable female nudes, which had become the specialty of Venetian paintings in the wake of Giorgione. This is the approach advanced by Una Romandelia in her book on Titian, who sees Titian's painting as a visual corollary to the ironic assessment of the Magdalene propagated by Pietro Aretino and others. By contrast, Alexander Nagel has attempted to read Titian's painting within the visual culture of the papacy of Clement VII. In Nagel's account, the period of the Clementine papacy led to a loosening of the strictures that had dominated and constricted devotional painting for centuries, as artists like Parmigianino, Rosso Fiorentino, and Titian, among others, began pushing the limits of what could reasonably be considered a devotional painting. It is important to observe that both of these accounts share a commitment to a notion of decorum, even when they suggested that certain pictorial experiments were invested in probing the boundaries of decorum, or even overturning it entirely. Nevertheless, these arguments are predicated on decorum. Now, there is some warrant for thinking that notions of decorum were taking hold in the 16th century. After all, responses to Titian's picture, and others like it, often have a "thou dost protest too much" quality to them. For example, Writing about another version of the Magdalene, Giorgio Vasari exclaimed that Titian painted, quote, a figure of St. Mary Magdalene from the middle of the thighs upward, all disheveled. That is, with hair falling over the shoulders, about the throat, and over the breast. The while that, raising the head with eyes fixed to heaven, she reveals remorse in the redness of her eyes, and her tears, repentance for her sin. Wherefore the picture moves mightily all who behold it. And what is more, although she is very beautiful, it moves not to lust, but to compassion. Compassion. That's an interesting choice made by the translator. The term in the Italian is commiserazione. Now, those might seem to have distinct connotations in English, but when you start probing on the etymology and usage of commiserazione in early modern Italian, very quickly you realize that the two terms were actually quite interchangeable. Indeed, the only definition given for commiserazione in the early editions of La Crusca is misericordia. And the minute that you turn to examine what exactly constitutes misericordia, you discover compassione. Misericordia is defined as affetto che si muove nell'animo nostro ad aver compassione d'altrui nelle sue miserie. So although compassion is perhaps not the best rendering of the Italian, it is not misguided. And I like the fact that compassion brings us back to some of the issues raised above with the definition of devotional pictures as images that incite compassion. But the question is, what sort of compassion, suffering with, does a painting like this try to elicit? Is Vasari being sincere, or is he simply giving cover to a picture whose focus is anything but commiseration? Is he being evasive because he knew that the picture consciously flouted the strict decorum of the genre of devotional painting? There is some evidence to suggest that Titian himself at least understood the subversive character of his Magdalenes. Sometime around 1561, Baccio Valori visited Titian in his studio in Venice, and there they discussed a painting of the Magdalene, likely the version that is today in the Hermitage. Quote, there I met Titian, almost immobilized by old age, who, despite the fact that he was very appreciated for painting from life, showed me a very attractive Magdalene in the desert. Also, I remember now that I told him that she was too attractive, so fresh and dewy for such penitence, having understood that I meant she should be gaunt through fasting. He answered laughingly that he had painted her on the first day that she entered the repentant state, before she began fasting, in order to be able to paint her as a penitent indeed, but also as lovely as he could. And that way she certainly was. Now, this wry sense of humor suggests that Titian was at least aware that his paintings of the voluptuous female saint were open to a variety of interpretations. While one could easily draw from this picture a message of penance and compassion, as Vasari had suggested, Valori's quip and Titian's witty response suggest that there are other ways to read the painting, which focus more on the voluptuous female figure than compassion, commiseration, and misericordia. As we've learned over the last few days, Vittoria was a deeply spiritual woman who was committed to authentic spirituality and an ambitious understanding of ecclesiastical reform. She also had great taste in art, obviously. Alexander Nagel and Una Romandalia have presented exemplary studies of the intimate exchange of letters and poems between Michelangelo and Vittoria. In this exchange of gift-giving, artistic technique and the reworking of pictorial types all take on theological valences, as we've just heard. Christian Kleinbub has written about Colonna's commission to Michelangelo of a painting of the Noli Tangere, and we'll hear more about that in just a few minutes. Rather than discuss it, I simply want to note that for however odd this painting might be, it still fits fairly comfortably into established boundaries of devotional picture making. And Dennis, you might disagree, I don't know, but we can talk about that. The Noli Tangere shows us a biblical scene. The same is true for the drawings of Christ's death. The grace and redemption purchased through his suffering, and the Virgin's participation in that event. Now, Michelangelo takes, of course, particular lines on these subjects, but they are very traditional subjects. Colonna's intense friendship with Michelangelo postdates the interaction with Titian by a number of years. However, I think it gives us warrant to ask, how her spiritual commitments might allow us to recalibrate what we think about how devotional pictures operate. Colonna was glossing Michelangelo's work on numerous letters that fall between identification, imitation, contrition, and everything in between. There is literary evidence to suggest that she glossed Titian's painting in a similarly multivalent fashion. She composed a poem in praise of the exemplary comportment of Mary Magdalene's contrition, which may, I stress the conditional here, may have been written in response to Titian's picture. I cite it in full. Donna accesa animosa e dall'errante volgo lontana, in solitario albergo parmi lieta veder, lasciando a tergo quanto non piace al ver eterno amante. E fermato il desio, fermar le piante sovra un gran monte. Ond'io mi specchio e tergo nel bell'esempio, e l'alma drizzo ed ergo dietro le orme beate, e l'opre sante. L'alta spelonca sua, questa alto scoglio, mi rassembra è il gran sol, il suo gran fuoco, che ogni animo gentil anco riscalda. In tal pensier di vil nodo mi sciolgo, pregando lei con voce ardita e balda, mi impetri dal Signor apo se loco. For the poet, the language of Petrarchan erotics, but also much else, as we've discussed in the last couple days, was certainly not understood to compromise the devotional function of a spiritual exemplar. And one can easily imagine that the spiritual notion of leaving behind the vil nodo of earthly chains, a sort of remaking of the Petrarchan corpus carcere, might find its pictorial analogon in female nudity. This comes out in another poem composed in honor of the Magdalene, which uses even more corporeal language. La bella donna, a cui dolente preme quel gran desio che sgombra ogni paura, di notte, sola, inerme, umile e pura, armata sol di viva ardente speme, entra dentro il sepolcro e piange e geme. Gli angeli lascia e più di sé non cura, ma ai piedi del Signore cade sicura, che il cor che arde d'amor di nulla teme. E dagli uomini eletti, a grazie tante, fonti insieme richiusi il lume vero, per timor parve nudo spirito ed ombra. Onde, se il vero dal falso non si adombra, convien dar alle donne il pregio intero, d'aver il cor più acceso e più costante. For Colonna, the spiritual and erotic were not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, the erotic capacity of the Magdalene seems to give her an even greater understanding. Her femininity is what gives her faith more power than any of the apostles. She has a capacity for compassion and conversion that none of Christ's disciples, male disciples, have. And here we might remember Rami Targoff's excellent presentation from yesterday and how Colonna inoculated herself against Ludovico Priuli's insinuations of impropriety by underlining how la mia carne tanto chiara could not possibly suffer from excessive erotic attachments, even as there is evidence that it was indeed suffering from some sort of erotic attachment. She is insisting that it is precisely the purity of her faith that prevents such attachments from taking over, even if that might not actually be true. For Colonna, the female body can be a medium and mode of knowing and expressing a love of the divine. Here I find it interesting to note that it is precisely what distinguishes the P.T. Magdalene from all of the other versions painted by Titian, that is to say, her nudity, the source and cause of the befuddlement among modern critics, which to me suggests that the painting was, if not explicitly made with Vittoria in mind, then oddly and serendipitously coincident with one of the driving charisms of her spiritual disposition. This is quite different from what Michelangelo did. Michelangelo had an incredibly sensitive understanding of Colonna's spirituality and developed works of art that fed on and into that spiritual economy. Titian, by contrast, seems to have projected into the mind and spirit of a woman that he did not know. In thinking and praying through her body, Vittoria was certainly not alone. Geoffrey Hamburger fundamentally transformed the history of art when he took seriously the visual devotion of nuns. But, as he himself made a point of emphasizing, the art that he worked on was ugly, this sort of stuff. It was something akin to outsider art, predicated on a crass lack of refinement that was understood to imbue works with spiritual and devotional immediacy, that substituted for grace and refinement. Hamburger's ideas have recently undergone serious and forceful revision, especially regarding the character of female devotion in Italy in the Renaissance. Giancarlo Periti's excellent study of the elite convent of San Paolo in Parma in the early 16th century offers insight into the visual culture of women who were quite similar to Colonna in power, wealth, and prestige. Periti obviously addresses the exceptional frescoes in the Camera di San Paolo, but to my mind, the breakthrough contribution in her attentive study is the kinesthetic and erotic logic that underlines nuns' everyday interaction with art. This is particularly present in her analysis of the tin-glazed maiolica floor. While many of the scenes show heads and mottos talking about fidelity, among other common topics, a surprising amount of these tiles overtly present iconography of erotic love, of Petrarchan love. Now, this hardly seems appropriate for women supposedly vowed to chastity. Periti therefore asks, and here I quote Periti, "What record would have been more playful and pleasurable to the nuns' downcast eyes than the semantics of love, staged and fictionalized in the appealing heads on the tile floors? The courtly poetic tradition of love from which these representations derive revolved not so much around the intimacy of sexual relations as idealization and imagination, transforming love into a liaison to be gained by individuals' special merits," end quote. Similarly, Titian presents a powerful female saint in full possession of her body, instrumentalizing her body to gain divine knowledge. Pace Vasari, this picture is not about penance and rejection of the mortal flesh. Rather, the painting is about conversion, which doesn't necessarily mean moving from sin to grace, though that is one definition of conversion. It can also mean movement toward. The Magdalene has now moved toward Christ, and because she lived through her body, as we all know from her apocryphal history, so too she shall worship through her body. And Titian captures this better than anyone ever had before him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was another very rich and complex talk. We'll have so much to talk about afterwards. And I want to introduce Dennis Geronimus, who received his PhD from Oxford University as Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Art History at New York University. He specializes in Italian Renaissance art with a particular emphasis on painting and graphic media of 15th and 16th century Tuscany, and has written a book on Piero di Cosimo, Visions Beautiful and Strange, published by Yale University Press in 2006, and was the guest curator for the first ever exhibition on Piero, which many of us saw, titled Piero di Cosimo, The Poetry of Painting in Renaissance Italy, which is the National Gallery in Washington and at the Uffizi. He also has a forthcoming book, which focuses on Piero di Cosimo's pupil Jacopo da Pontormo, and it's titled Jacopo da Pontormo, Altered Grace, Human and Divine, which will also be published by Yale. His talk today is A More Loving and Constant Heart, Vittoria Colonna, Alfonso d'Avolos, Michelangelo, and the Complicated History of Pontormo's Noli me Tangere.
Well, to begin, I must join everyone in thanking Virginia and the rest of your staff, Alice, and everyone else for, first of all, the very kind invitation, but also the great hospitality. It's not every day that we get to stay at Villa La Pietra. My only possible regret is that someone had the nerve to schedule a conference entitled A Legacy of Ladies, Women Artists and Patrons at the Late Medici Court, exactly on the day that we are speaking about Vittoria Colonna, the nerve. So I'm personally all the more grateful to all of you for choosing this conference this morning, so I hope to justify your choice. Yesterday's proceedings eloquently framed Vittoria Colonna as progenitor and exemplar. And here we have a portrait from the Palazzo Venezia in Rome with her holding what certainly looks to me like laurel, even though her medals often show her holding balsam. And of course the frontispiece from her Rime from 1542, published in Venice. So yesterday's proceedings eloquently framed Vittoria as progenitor and exemplar, as poet, as reformer, as paragon of piety. Extending on my colleague's papers this morning, I would like to address a devotional model of her own, something of an intriguing puzzle, very tantalizing in its traces, faintly visible, and many now vanished, that is nonetheless a tale predominantly about two women, Colonna and her most affecting source of emulation, potentially matched only by St. Catherine of Alexandria and the Virgin Mary herself, the Mary Magdalene. The story also features a cohort of male protagonists of joined destinies, patrons, painters, and a string of intermediaries facilitating the process of artistic production. Their relationship to the Marchioness of Pescara, both direct or indirect, serving as the ligatures that unite them all. Chief among this latter group is another pairing, that of Michelangelo and Jacopo da Pontormo, as we'll see, bound together twice within a year, in close collaboration and intensive labor. And labor is something that I'm very interested in and would very much like to reinsert into our conversation today. To begin, I would like to turn to one of the key themes of yesterday's proceedings, Vittoria Colonna's widowhood, as her time of loss, longing, and need of consolation coincided with her deepening identification with the Mary Magdalene, a compelling female exemplum who expressed ultimate fidelity and perseverance to Christ during the time of the Passion. In addition to Colonna's love and epistolary poems, over 215, I think I counted 217, but now there are probably more, spiritual poems survive. These constitute the large majority of her penned verse. Among her religious lyrics, her rime spirituali, are a number directly invoking the Mary Magdalene. Few are as impassioned as that in which Colonna describes the Magdalene's visit to Christ's tomb while his male disciples were in hiding. She writes, "Seized in her sadness by that great desire which banishes all fear, this beautiful woman, all alone, by night, helpless, humble, pure, and armed only with a living, burning hope, entered the sepulchre and wept and lamented. Ignoring the angels, caring nothing for herself, she fell at the feet of the Lord, secure, for her heart, aflamed with love, feared nothing. And the men chosen to share so many graces, though strong, were shut up together in fear. The true light seemed to them only a shadow. If then the true is not a friend to the false, we may give to women all due recognition for having a more loving and a more constant heart." There are other allusions to the Magdalene in Colonna's writings, and indeed the poet had a special fondness for the woman of the Gospels, inspiring a dialogue springing no doubt, at least in part, from her lived experience. And this following, of course, again, Colonna's widowhood and her own abandonment to an extent of the worldly life. As I think most of us, if not all of us in the room, given this audience, already know, Colonna was betrothed at the age of 4 to Fernando, or Ferrante Francesco d'Avalos, the 5th Marquis of Pescara. He was only 2 years older. Colonna married him in 1509 at the age of 17. As we also know, the couple had only about 1 year together before d'Avalos left Naples for northern Italy to join Vittoria's father in fighting for Spain and the papal forces against the French. In 1525, now 16 years since the couple's marriage, each year except the first marked by absence, the French were finally defeated at the Battle of Pavia, but d'Avalos was never to return home, dying in Milan on December 2nd, 1525. And here we have a commemorative pair of medals now in Vienna from 1525, the year of his death. My focus today is a very specific narrative featuring the Magdalene, the Noli Tangere, the title of numerous medieval and Renaissance images that corresponds to Christ's words in Latin form spoken to the Magdalene, "Touch me not." And you have to forgive me because I too, like Christopher, was working furiously until the very last moment, and I kind of got tired of the captions, and I want you to focus on the images, where many of us or all of us are visual people anyway, and I have a feeling you already know your Giotto and your Maestà by Duccio, but I kind of gave up after the first slide. But here we have early Trecento, All Trecento examples by, of course, Duccio and Giotto, and the school of Giotto, and probably Jacopo di Cione. And just to give you a taste, north of the Alps, and here there are no captions, so this is a test. We have, of course, Martin Schongauer. We have Albrecht Dürer, a woodcut from the Small Passion from 1509 to 1511. And I would argue that there, and we're going to return to this theme, the figure of Christ as gardener is not yet touching the forehead of the Magdalene. And then we have a work by Schöfflein after Dürer, another woodcut, and a Schongauer again, possibly follower of, from Colmar, and the school of Roger van der Weyden in the National Gallery, the smaller, slender panel next to it. We, of course, also have works in all sorts of different media, including Buglioni's beautiful terracotta example here. And of course, we could go on and on. But this type is important because, as we'll see, Michelangelo's model is exceptionally novel. According to the Gospel of St. John in 20:14-18, Mary weeps beside Christ's empty tomb following the resurrection. When the risen Christ appears at daybreak on Easter morning, the Magdalene first mistakes him for a gardener, who she hopes may have knowledge of the whereabouts of Christ's absent body. And here I must say that I don't think anyone rivals Lavinia Fontana in her Uffizi canvas of 1518 in disguising Christ here as an altogether convincing gardener, complete with this very fashionable-looking straw hat and shovel. Not a hoe, an actual shovel. Soon, however, the despondent Magdalene recognizes the figure as Christ himself and makes an exuberant attempt to embrace him. What follows, as represented arguably most famously by Fra Angelico in his convent fresco in San Marco, begun around 1438, is an engaging, almost dance-like drama of contrary forces, as well as gestures, those of advance and retreat, of unbridled joy and reticence, of touch sought and poignantly withheld. For ultimately, Christ arrests and deflects Mary's movement towards him, instructing her not to touch, and as he has not yet ascended to heaven. And yet, how urgent, how insistently passionate and empowered Michelangelo reimagines his own Magdalene. For one thing, she stands. She not only stands, she strides forward. To my knowledge, this is virtually, and I say virtually because as we know in the history of art, nothing is ever unprecedented, it seems like. But I would claim that at least in Italy in the 16th century, and I've looked at 15th century models as well, it's beyond my search. But I wanted to give you two quite astonishing examples. Neither one of them I can't imagine would have been seen by Pontormo, but on the left we have a ivory plaque with traces of gold leaf showing the journey to Emmaus, and below, almost in the pose of a kind of dancing rabbi, Noli Tangere, hey. And this is from Spain and dates to as early as 1115 to 20. It's now at the Met. So my students can visit it anytime they want. And a Hans Holbein, which is no less remarkable. This is by Hans Holbein the Younger, and it lives in Hampton Court in the Royal Collection from 1526 to 28. And I just want to point out this remarkable, I keep using the word remarkable because it really genuinely is. There's an open tomb, and within the tomb, illuminated by their own light, like magic lanterns, are angels. Almost like kind of supernatural celestial fireflies. So in 1531, to return to Pontormo's model, a time coinciding with the period when Colonna composed the majority of her love poems, that is to say between roughly 1526 and the early 1530s, Michelangelo conceived a composition seen here that rivals Colonna's own spiritual poetics in its evocation of ardent love and transcendent sacrality. It seems clear that the choice of subject represented in the work originated with Colonna herself. Yet earlier, on March 5th of the same year, 1531, Colonna, as you now know full well, had commissioned another painting, again, earlier in the year, expressing her attachment to the Magdalene. It was then, of course, that Colonna had asked Titian, with Duke Federico Gonzaga of Mantua via the Marchese del Vasto, as Chris described, acting as a go-between, to paint for her a Magdalene, one made to appear as pitiful, or as Chris said, lachrymose, as possible. Titian completed the painting in just over a month, a work that may or may not be, again, by Titian. And here, I have to say, I would be remiss not to mention, since this is obviously a comparison of like to like, of Titian's, to my eye, most virtuoso youthful work, dating roughly to 1512 to 15, his own Noli Tangere in the National Gallery of London. As many of you know, X-ray analysis at the National Gallery has revealed that some years ago that Christ was originally, so as you're not disappointed, was originally represented with a gardener's hat. I don't know if it would have rivaled Lavinia's. And in fact, he originally was turning away and not pivoting and turning toward, or I should say rotating towards the Magdalene. And the landscape was also drastically altered while the work was in progress. Meanwhile, the circumstances surrounding the genesis of the Michelangelo-designed Noli Tangere, along with a faithful copy here in Florence, is described in some detail by Giorgio Vasari. As we shall see, both versions, together with a painting of a pagan subject, were executed by another hand, that belonging again to Pontormo, who was 19 years Michelangelo's junior at the time. So Vasari writes, meanwhile, after Signor Alfonso d'Avalos, Marchese del Vasto, had obtained from Michelangelo Buonarroti, through Fra Niccolo della Magna, a cartone of Christ appearing to the Magdalene in the garden, he did his utmost to have Pontormo execute it for him in painting. Buonarroti having said to him that no one could serve him better. Jacopo did then execute that work to perfection, and it was judged to be a rare painting, both for the grandeur of Michelangelo's design and for Jacopo's coloring, per la grandezza del disegno di Michelangelo e per lo colorito di Jacopo. Whereupon, after it had been seen by Signor Alessandro Vitelli, who was then in Florence in command of the garrison of soldiers, he had Jacopo execute another picture from the same cartoon, which he then sent to Città di Castello and had put in his own house. The story doesn't quite end there, and this is quite the transition. Then, Vasari continues, seeing how greatly Michelangelo esteemed Pontormo, and how diligently Pontormo brought to completion and translated so perfectly and beautifully into paintings the designs and cartoons of Michelangelo, Bartolomeo Bettini so set about things that Buonarroti, his close friend, made for him a cartoon of a nude Venus being kissed by Cupid, to be executed as a painting by Pontormo and placed in the center of one of his living rooms, in the lunettes of which he had begun to have painted by Bronzino, figures of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, with the intention to put there, in his camera, all the other poets who had been sung in Tuscan prose and verse. So having received the cartoon, Jacopo executed it perfectly. The word perfectly keeps reappearing, at his leisure. And so, just as Vittoria Colonna arranged for proxies to facilitate her request of a painting of the Noli Tangere from Michelangelo, so too did Michelangelo seek out Pontormo to fulfill the commission by proxy as the painting's executor. Not once, but twice, and in close succession. More likely than not, Michelangelo did so for the sake of expediency. The sculptural Venus and Cupid seen here, showing the goddess of love kissing her son while disarming him of his dangerous arrows, was fashioned for a fellow Republican sympathizer, namely Bettini. So given Michelangelo's own political allegiances, this could not have only been the case of clashing politics. In fact, the allegory now in the Accademia was confiscated by Duke Alessandro de' Medici. But politics, as you'll see, will soon potentially play a role. For the Venus and Cupid, one large-scale cartoon does survive. It survives in the Museo di Capodimonte in Naples, although by one of his followers, for the making of yet another copy of this design as well. The Noli Tangere of greatest interest to us today is the first of the two versions, the one seen again on the left, the original, ordered by Nicholas von Schönberg, Nicola della Magna, as Vasari refers to him, who was governor of Florence under Pope Clement VII and Archbishop of Capua a city in Campania, just north of Naples. Smaller in dimensions than the second version seen here on the right in the Casa Buonarroti, 124 by 95 centimeters compared to 175 by 133 on the right, both of almost an identical ratio of height to length, and thus corresponding to the intimation of a smaller scale with regard to the cartoon. This panel on the left may be identified with one that is currently in a private collection, virtually impossible to see, in the small town of Busto Arsizio in the province of Varese, just northwest of Milan. Pontormo's panel was last shown publicly in an exhibition entitled Magdalene tra Sacro Profano in 1986. Although Nicholas von Schomburg, a nephew of Colonna, was the original link in the commission's chain, he played the role of facilitator, having secured the work for Alfonso d'Avalos, governor of Milan and commander-general of imperial forces. We have met d'Avalos already this morning, and here he is joined by a bronze portrait medal of 1535, again in Vienna. Born into an illustrious Spanish Neapolitan family, he would have shared Neapolitan roots with the Archbishop of Capua. He was also a relative by marriage of Vittoria Colonna, being the younger cousin of her now-deceased husband. d'Avalos was most brilliantly captured by Titian in the winter of 1503 in this portrait on the right, executed in Bologna, now at the Getty, representing the imposing Marchese in a magnificent suit of armor and assisted by a page. And so, working on behalf of his relative, d'Avalos completed the involved transaction for the Noli Tangere, passing on the finished panel to its final destination, the Marchioness of Pescara. Nothing remains of Michelangelo's cartoon for the Noli Tangere, although a written account of its making does survive, and it's quite fascinating. The work is first mentioned in a series of 3 letters, all dating to 1531, and all written by Giovanni Battista Figiovanni, the canon of San Lorenzo, to Michelangelo. In the first letter of April 11, 1531, Figiovanni defines the project's parameters. The painter had full freedom to elaborate his invention, taking into consideration, however, that the work was destined for a rather small or confined place. For several months, Michelangelo appears to have refused to work. Imagine that, Michelangelo. But in Figiovanni's second, undated letter of that autumn, he extols Michelangelo's cartoon as a cosa divina. After finishing the cartoon by October and showing it to Alfonso d'Avalos, Michelangelo received permission in the third letter from Figiovanni to delegate the pictorial execution to Pontormo, allowing the latter use of his own house to paint the work, meaning presumably under Michelangelo's direct supervision. Also surviving, as seen here on the left, are 2 rare traces of Michelangelo's preliminary brainstorms, here for the figure, of course, of the risen Christ, rapidly sketched in red chalk. The likely second version of the Noli Tangere may be seen by everyone as early as tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. In the Casa Buonarroti. Its presence in Florence was first mentioned in 1666 when it was transferred from the collection of Cardinal Carlo de' Medici to the Grand Ducal collections in the inventory of that year. It was identified as the original version by Pontormo at that time. Now most commonly attributed to Pontormo's student, associate, and lifelong companion Agnolo Bronzino, an attribution with which I happen to agree, it is most likely that this copy was made for the condottiero Alessandro Vitelli, Signore of Città di Castello and later captain of the imperial troops under the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in the city of France. The dusky tonalities of the landscape are especially characteristic of Bronzino, as testified by comparisons for one example, his allegorical portrait of Dante, a canvas of 1532-33, mentioned, as you might remember, in Bettini's Camera, and now in a private collection in Florence. Dawn arrives over the highest, bluest hill, stay here, while leading our gaze down to the foreground, ambiguously placed, gradually disappearing. Steps curve to the left between the 2 figures. The smooth enameled finish is certainly also reminiscent of Bronzino's other works from the 1530s, and here you see it hanging or installed on the left. And now I'm going to address its companion, because hanging directly next to what I attribute to Bronzino, the panel in the Casa Buonarroti, is another variant ascribed to Giovanni Battista Franco. Dating to 1537, the Venetian-born master's composition is set against an ivy-colored rocky outcrop at left, doubling as a tonal foil for the Magdalene, and intriguingly appropriates a castle tower standing among jagged rocks from Albrecht Dürer's Vision of St. Eustace, engraving of 1501 at far right. Though probably coincidental in the context of Franco's copy, the prominent appearance of ivy certainly brought to my mind Colonna's achingly beautiful sonnet that compares the soul to uprooted ivy, with Christ's cross as the evergreen plant's supporting frame. Michelangelo's highly unorthodox personal treatment of an otherwise popular scriptural motif obviously proved to be a big hit, as Franco produced yet a second iteration, now softening the features of Christ, but draping him in a high-keyed pink robe. The rock face at left now seems to almost dissolve into smoke, melding with the storm clouds beyond. This dramatic sky further accentuates the tension of this encounter. This version introduced here is now in the Dayton Art Institute in Ohio. And meanwhile, if you're interested to see what form Bronzino's own pictorial interpretation of the same narrative had subsequently taken, we have this example, a Noli me tangere of 3 decades later, dating 1561 and now in the Louvre, a banner image from John Sherman's definition of mannerism as the stylish style in its balletic pose and jewel-like palette. This also seems a good place to bring up the question of intended function, as Bronzino's late panel was originally destined for the Cappella Cavalcanti in the Florentine church here of Santo Spirito. And so while it remains possible that Colonna wanted a Noli me tangere from Michelangelo as a work of art, in other words, as a Michelangelo, it certainly may have served as an altarpiece, albeit a small one, because the Busto Arsizio panel measures just over 4 feet in height. And it remains plausible, I would argue, that the copies to follow Pontormo's version, here you see one by Allori on copper, and another by another follower. Actually, the one on copper on the left was acquired by Leo Steinberg in 1964 for $250. And the copy on the left by an unknown follower was recently on the art market as well. So I would argue that these kinds of copies may in fact have been prized as much, if not more so, as collector's items as they were aids to private devotion. To return to the date of the commission, the year 1531 is important, for, as also noted by Christopher, it predates the first physical meeting between Michelangelo and Colonna by some 7 years. In fact, it predates any documented contact between the two, and so the drawings that Jessica discussed usually I think are dated to about 1539 to 1540, so again, a bit later. And it's very likely that Colonna was, again, in Ischia at the time. This being the case, one can only imagine how deeply distasteful the commission for the Noli me tangere might have been for the fiercely Republican artist on account of his original client, Schomburg, followed by the Marchese del Vasto. In a letter of December 26, 1531, Michelangelo's pupil Antonio Minni suggestively relates to Antonio Gondi that Michelangelo is said to have, quote, not to have provided in his own way this work, referring specifically to the cartoon for the Noli me tangere, and that this cartoon was created in a moment of creative fury, and this was not necessarily meant as a positive statement. Taking into account that the cartoon was first to be delivered to the commander of a hostile, invading, and recently victorious army that had recently laid siege and took control of his home city, Michelangelo must, at the very least, harbored uneasy, conflicted feelings about this commission. Ultimately, he could not decline it, with the new governor of Florence in the service of Clement VII, no less, personally asking for the cartoon's execution. Few, however, have really called attention to the political ramifications of this commission, one early exception being Charles de Tolnay, writing on the Medici Chapel in 1970, it's a wonderful quote, "Was the picture not intended to be a sort of warning that occupied Florence was not to be touched by sinful hands?" To make matters worse, at least for Michelangelo, not for us as students of Renaissance art, the production of the Noli me tangere cartoon coincided with yet another request in addition to Michelangelo's already protracted work on the Medici new sacristy in San Lorenzo. This request came from Baccio Valori, the de facto ruler of Florence, before his replacement by Schomburg in early 1531. Valori had already approached Michelangelo to design a new palace for him on Via Pandolfini that had been vandalized by the Republican government in 1529. This latest commission was this Apollo, now in the Bargello. Little wonder then that this carving, like so many by Michelangelo's hand, was left unfinished as a non finito. In a letter of June 1531, just over a month after expressing to Sebastiano del Piombo his great pleasure at hearing that Michelangelo was working day and night on the new sacristy, Pope Clement VII now expressed his concern that the artist's superhuman exertions may damage his health. Clement suggested that Michelangelo should occasionally go for a walk. As we might guess, Michelangelo wasn't one to take it easy. And around 1542, 11 years after providing the cartoon for the Noli Tangere, he, now in his late 60s, returned to the idea of a two-person religious drama, likewise drawn from the Gospel of St. John in his Christ and the Female Samaritan at the well seen here. Seen in a preparatory black chalk sketch in a private collection, this design too was intended for Vittoria Colonna, and has even led one art historian to suggest that this later design, inspiring the print by Nicolas Beatrice in 1546 on the right, may have been intended as a pendant to the Noli Tangere. I would express serious skepticism about this, given the much smaller scale of painted copies after this drawing, as does Bernardine Barnes. The largest measures 77 centimeters, but many are in their 30s. And yet it may certainly be considered a spiritual companion, a brilliant variation on a similar tenet, that of, as Christopher pointed out, sola fide, or salvation through faith alone. And there does, in fact, survive a small-scale triptych commissioned by Francesco del Pugliese around 1490 that features to either side of the Ursula Master's Volta Santo Filippino Lippi's scenes of the two revelatory encounters, the Samaritan woman on the left and the Noli Tangere with Mary Magdalene on the right. In comparing the two versions of the Noli Tangere, the clues as to authorship dwell in the details. Christ's extended hand in the Florence copy on the right, upon close viewing, is not very confidently painted, and the brushwork somehow lacks spontaneity and vigor. The Lombard version on the left, the smaller version, appears to be painted more quickly and a number of passages very thinly. And the figure of the Magdalene in particular, in the original, as I would argue, almost seems to tremble forward as she steps ardently, beseechingly, toward the retreating Christ, the outlines of her form revealing a number of pentiments, especially seen in the dark green sleeves of her gamura and the lower section of her orange overdress. Giovanni Colombini, the founder of the Gesuati in Siena, in fact describes the Magdalene's emotionally turbulent state during this encounter thus: "She went searching for her beloved spouse as if drunk and half mad." Notable in the Busto Arsizio panel, by way of striking differences to the Bronzino version, are also the closer proximity of the figures, especially that of Mary, as they appear pressed against the picture plane. There's also the more intricately conceived townscape and city gate that, to my friends, I called it the Wall of China. But in reality, the town battlements actually suggest a sense of contemporaneity, that this is a place not beyond our ken. And here it is worth recalling Pontormo's attentiveness to architecture, part observed, part imagined in his earlier Benintendi Epiphany, now in the Galleria Palatina. And finally, there's the presence of an open sepulchre, just behind and directly between the two figures, at once signaling the distance between them, and yet how achingly narrow that distance really is, more symbolic than real. Any hint of the steps visible in Bronzino's panel, presumably intended to lead down to the never-executed tomb, or so we think, are here absent in his panel. And the strange impression that the open tomb produces in its almost perilous proximity to Christ is that he seemingly has just stepped out of the sepulchre in the guise of a gardener, his heavy hoe awkwardly supported between his left hand and side, and that before he has really had a chance to even take a step, the Magdalene is virtually upon him. Upon closer study, it is in fact quite possible, and I was really taking a very close look at this yesterday, so we're looking at this detail here, that Bronzino in fact did originally include the outline of a tomb and then painted it out. In its pressing immediacy, the choice of the sepulchre's spatial placement here could not be more different than a work that many of you already know. Michelangelo's earlier solution in his unfinished entombment, commissioned in 1500, the work was abandoned upon Michelangelo's departure for Florence in spring 1501, and here it is worth mentioning that the chapel in question was popularly called the Cappella della Pietà, although by 1506 it was dedicated to the Mary Magdalene. As Alexander Nagel noted in tracing the circumstances of this commission, San Agostino in Rome was already known as a haven for the prostitute community in Rome as early as the beginning of the 1500s. In the London panel, the similarly open-lidded tomb, visible only in its underdrawing at right, is suggestive of time's passage, of transit. Standing on a hill, it awaits the delivery of Christ's body, lifted from its previously prone position and presented as a kind of imago pietatis. So to conclude, saint, sinner, penitent, first witness, and intercessor, the Mary Magdalene was a conflation of several biblical female personas, and so too Pontormo entwines issues of faith, gender, and the senses, as activated by hearing and by voice, a beloved's gaze, and sought but evaded touch. The Magdalene's encounter in the garden with the risen Christ stands at once as a parallel but also as an antithesis to the doubling that one sees in the incredulity of St. Thomas, an incredulous witness, right, who was invited to touch. In fact, his arm is pulled into the gaping wound of Christ in these examples in English, early example by the Master of the Mary Psalter in the Bodleian, and the Venetian example from 1505 by Cima di Conigliano, and of course, probably the most famous of all by Caravaggio, right? I hear expressions of not just surprise but shock. But then you also have rather more traditional, almost Mary Magdalene-like poses of St. Thomas, in which he not only kneels but almost genuflects before the risen figure of Christ. By contrast, the Magdalene is asked to believe only by sight and only by the spoken word, and above all by her faith alone. Her encounter is a private one, and her conversion takes place in the moment of her oral recognition of Christ's voice. She became the model for men and certainly for women of effective piety. And as Catherine Ludwig Jensen and Lisa Raffanelli have argued, her role as first witness presents presented concerns about the authority of women's senses and their agency, as claimed through their own words and their deeds. Resistance to her authority, in the way that it translated to teaching and preaching, certainly came from Ambrose and Thomas of Aquinas. It often also came from female sources, including Birgitta of Sweden, all mothers, in the examples that Jensen gives, who preferred to adhere to the Eastern tradition of the Virgin Mary being the first witness to the risen Christ, endowing her with all female glory, to quote Jensen, including the Magdalene. Di Tolnay offers us the most evocative description of Michelangelo's and Pontormo's scene. Quote, magically attracted, the Magdalene approaches the vision of Christ with the uncertain steps of a somnambulist. She spreads out her arms as if she wished to embrace the Savior, who, however, seems to withdraw with a repelling gesture and is to her unattainable. In Michelangelo's composition, the magical attraction of the two figures is developed from the creation of Adam in the Sistine ceiling, unquote. Fraught with tension and ambiguity, Christ, in fact, appears to touch the Magdalene, nearly touch her breast. So you can't touch me, but I can touch you, right? Thus dramatically violating his own instructions to Mary. And on this point, there's certainly a variance of opinion. Christopher mentioned the Christian Kleinbub article of 2013. But I say appears, and I say nearly, because I believe on the basis of what I see, that Christ's right index finger actually hovers before and is thus silhouetted against her red garment and her left breast proper, as she leans forward, and does so suggestively by pointing not only to her breast, but of course her heart, without touching it. And though uncommonly rare, and this is the example by Bronzino on the left, and which is even more ambiguous, but the less ambiguous example by Franco as well. There are examples, in fact, and they're quite spectacular in their oddity and their originality, in which Christ not only touches Mary, but actually lays his hand on her head, as in the example on the right by Cornelis van Oossanen in Kassel. And my personal favorite is the Lucas van Leyden print, always a master of pictorial, both solemnity and wit. This is from 1519. Michelangelo's design, so these are of course unambiguous. Michelangelo's design is indeed one of surprising erotic spirituality or spiritual eroticism, to set aside here the false dichotomy between the two. Nonetheless, I would argue that the moment captured in his panel was meant to be seen as one pregnant with meaning and expectation, the possibility of touch bestowed, and is thus defined by an unresolvable tension between the consummation of contact and the ultimate denial of corporeal mediation. As we have seen, Vittoria Colonna did not commission the Noli Me Tangere directly from Michelangelo, relying instead not on one but two male mediators to secure the work on her behalf. This more private, quasi-anonymous approach to patronage strikes a notable contrast with two of the arguably best-known examples of Italian female patronage in the early Cinquecento. The bereft Atalanta Baglioni's request from Raphael for an entombment in 1507 to stand as a kind of votive offering for her murdered son, Grifonetto, in a church in Perugia, and the widowed Elena Baiardi's request for Parmigianino for the so-called Madonna of the Long Neck in 1534, this altarpiece destined for the family's chapel in Santa Maria dei Servi in Parma. Colonna's process of securing Michelangelo's design, as animated by Pontormo's brush, betrays a markedly different strategy. Yet, this is not to say that she lacked agency in relation to her female counterparts, Baglioni and Baiardi. In fact, it aligns her quite closely with someone like Isabella d'Este and her favored employment of artistic agents. In the end, what an intensely empowering vision to imagine in what ultimately became Colonna's convent quarters, gazing as she would here upon Michelangelo's evocation of the Epistolorum Apostola, the first to witness the risen Christ, and as, quote, the apostle to the apostles, the first to communicate the vision to his 12 closest male followers. Christ's appearance given the Magdalene's past before conversion thus served as a powerful reminder that he had come to us not only for the righteous, but for the sinners. How powerful a bond the reform-minded Colonna must have felt in the presence of Christ's most passionate devotee. In her own writings, Colonna in fact expresses a sense of disbelief as to why so many good people who had experienced contact with Christ during his lifetime were not present at the crucifixion, who had abandoned the Savior, including the 4 apostles. Colonna, by contrast, singles out the Magdalene for special praise as one of the few followers of Christ who were there on Golgotha and who did receive his grace. In receiving Pontormo's Noli Me Tangere, Colonna was to embark on a transformative spiritual journey of her own and a richly fulfilling dialogue, one that she came to share for the next 16 years until her own death in 1547 with Michelangelo, her dear friend, her ideal reader, and her pious lover. Thank you.
Qualche questione per Jessica e una per Chris. Una delle 2 lettere di Michelangelo conservate in minuta al Museo Buonarroti esiste anche nella versione originale, è stata scoperta nel 2006 da Residori, cioè è la versione realmente spedita a Vittoria. Una domanda, la Madonna di San Luca che hai mostrato, mi chiedevo se non fosse più probabile che la Colonna avesse in mente un'altra versione sempre conservata a Roma, chiaramente ce ne sono numerose, tutte a Roma, in particolare ho in mente quella conservata a San Lorenzo in Damaso, chiesa che sicuramente la Colonna ha frequentato perché ascoltava lì le prediche di Ochino, e che non presenta il bambino in braccio, di cui infatti non si fa menzione nel sonetto, e se vogliamo è ancora più stilizzata di quella che hai mostrato, il chiaroscuro è ancora più assente, solo un suggerimento. E ultima curiosità, hai mostrato il crocifisso con le poesie di Marc-Antoine Muret. Se mi puoi dare qualche informazione in più su questa rappresentazione, perché il manoscritto per Michelangelo, prima di essere alla Biblioteca Vaticana, è stato per secoli al Collegio Romano dei Gesuiti e è molto probabile che ci sia arrivato come dono della biblioteca appunto di Muret. Non è sicuro, non si sa come questo manoscritto sarebbe entrato in possesso di Muret, però è molto probabile che sia passato nelle mani di Muret. Quindi,
So yes, absolutely. One of the letters, the one that's in Casa Buonarroti, there's also in the collection Martin Bodmer, I believe, and there is a slightly different variant, especially in speaking about seeing a holy face. There's a reference to the holy face that you promised to show me, and so there, I put this one up in part just to again articulate this question of multiple hands at play, and of course, and I didn't want to go into even greater depth, but thank you. Yes, so there is another version of this letter in a private collection, which also is not quite the same. So, and then let's see, your second. Yes, the image that I showed was honestly just sort of as a placeholder at this point. But thank you for, you said San Lorenzo in Domaso, so I will look for I will look at that, because it would be nice to have something to correlate more directly. So that was just a tool, but so thank you for that comment, and also for the insight into the possible connection to Muret's library, which I was not aware of that connection, and the Michelangelo collection. But what I was going, just very briefly, that his writing and his writing on the that was appended to the print has certainly been seen as a codification of Counter-Reformation reading in a very strict sense. So this is one of the, I didn't want to go into greater depth, but this is one of the ways in which these prints were modified and have been seen to be brought in line with Counter-Reformation, especially by explicitly removing the sense of doubt that seems to be imbued in the original Michelangelo drawing. And so other versions also have Michelangelo portrayed in the moment where he is commending himself to the Father, instead of the moment where he is asking why he's been abandoned. And that also seems to, again, conform to sort of Counter-Reformation ideas. But I would love to speak with you more about this possible, more explicit connection, because all of these sort of collecting and hands through which they passed, there's even more to say, which I didn't have time about. The Campion Hall was owned by the Venusti at one point, the Venusti was owned by the Cavalieri as well, so there are all of these very interesting.
una domanda anche per Chris. Come interpreti tu quindi quel lacrimosa della lettera a Tiziano? Cioè, deve essere lacrimosa l'immagine o deve suscitare lacrime nell'osservatore? Perché questo è dirimente rispetto all'interpretazione e l'identificazione dell'immagine, perché la Maddalena Pitti non piange.
Allora, io interpreto questo termine lacrimosa in una maniera più, come dire, più generico, che deve essere una presentazione, deve essere una raffigurazione che si presta ad un'interpretazione di conversione di qualche tipo. E la differenza qua, secondo me, sta cercando di differenziare quest'immagine. Gonzaga sta cercando di richiedere un'immagine più vicino a quelli che sono prodotti in Lombardia da pittori come Giampietrino e altri pittori lombardi, dopo Leonardo, che hanno prodotto anche loro immagini della Maddalena nuda a mezzo busto, che sono veramente lacrimose. E secondo me Gonzaga sta cercando di suscitare da Tiziano qualche sentiero, di un'immagine che vada in quella direzione. Però Tiziano non è che abbia prodotto un'immagine lacrimosa. Lui era capace di produrre immagini lacrimose, per esempio la Mater Dolorosa, la prima versione a Madrid del 54, c'ha delle lacrime che sono dei goccioloni, ma proprio alla maniera dei fiamminghi, però qui non l'ha fatto. Invece ha fatto una Maddalena che palesemente ha pianto, però non lo rende così smarcato, così letterale come Gonzaga forse vorrebbe.
you for 3 exceptional talks. I'd love to ask you all questions, but I'm going to ask Chris a question. Although, Professor Geronimus, you furnished me with the kernel of this question through your reference to Leo Steinberg, proud owner of a Noli me Tangere. Chris, I was interested in your talk because of the way you got at questions of this very, very erotic image and how it was perceived in its own time. And so I think immediately of the debate between Leo Steinberg and Caroline Walker Bynum, in which he looks at all these perceived to be erotic images of the naked Christ and claims that that shows Christ's humanity, whereas Caroline Walker Bynum claims that the written sources in the Renaissance don't necessarily show that people were looking at these images of the naked Christ and seeing the same sort of erotic content. I guess my question is, you seem to draw almost a parallel and tried to show a harmony between Colonna's poems and this image of the Magdalene. But is it not possible, sort of following Bynum, instead to see a disjuncture, to claim that in that way, when someone like Colonna would have looked at Titian's Magdalene, she wasn't seeing an erotic image? I mean, her poetry of that nature isn't erotic per se. I mean, it's
absolutely.
bodily.
It's incarnated spirituality,
Okay.
and there's a difference between incarnated spirituality and nudity. Heather Sexton Graham published an essay, I think in 2008, where she sort of tries to explicitly map a Bynuminian, how do we adjectivize that? She tries to map Bynum onto the Magdalene. And, you know, it evokes a certain, because there's the kind of gender-bending question of the body in Christ, right? You know, the body, Christ is effeminized because he gives liquid to all of us and because we eat his body and all of those things that Bynum has so eloquently observed. And Heather, I mean, it's a great essay. The place where it becomes difficult is that all of that is developed in the realm of Christology, of, you know, Christological theology. And then to transpose that into the realm of the Magdalene becomes a little bit difficult. And so I would say that this consciousness raising that Bynum and Steinberg have done about the status of the body is absolutely core to what I'm saying. I don't want to hitch my cart too specifically to either side of this debate, precisely because it is mostly unfolding with reference to the Virgin and Christ specifically. And I think it becomes a little bit more problematic, but also less fraught when you start dealing with a saint, because, you know, there are not theological, the same theological allegiances connected to the body of the Magdalene. Now, of course, we do have relics of it, and there was this idea that the place where Christ had touched her forehead had become, you know, an incorruptible site. So, like, there is a discussion of the body there, but I think there's a little more freedom.
Thank you for really wonderful papers. This is a question both for Dennis and for Jessica. I don't know if you can both answer. We don't have a lot of time. But both of your talks raise really interesting questions about the status of the original, what it means to be an original work of art. And Jessica, you indirectly alluded to, I think, or at least you mentioned the aura, and I thought of Benjamin's essay, obviously, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and what the status of I'm thinking about both the drawing that lies behind the Pontormo, the drawing that was reproduced endlessly for Michelangelo, and then also what we're looking at right now, for example, what it means to have a hand. And when did Vittoria, having studied all of the letters extant that I have found, I know Veronica's found a few more, when did she use her own hand, and when did that matter? So from my experience of working in the Subiaco archive and the others, the only time that Vittoria used her own hand was to Michelangelo and to Ascanio. And there are a few other, like, not important notes. But in other words, when does the authenticity of something depend upon the actual hand? Why doesn't Vittoria protest the Pontormo execution, or did she protest it? Not that we know of. And I'm also thinking of the word disegno, which Michelangelo uses in such an interesting way when he gets angry at her, and the only fight that we know that sort of lovers, a little quarrel when he is angry for her requesting prematurely the gift, something Nagel and others have written so wonderfully about. But he says, il mio disegno è guasto. And disegno is his idea of the gift, but the drawing. But so in other words, I guess in different ways, the question is the drawing authentic, the authentic original, still sort of perceived through the executed painting that Pontormo does, so that it doesn't offend her in a way that it might have offended her, for example, in your rich example? So I don't know if you could both respond to that. I know that's a lot.
Leo Steinberg, that quite remarkable little painting on copper, I would argue that by the time that we get to copies of copies of copies, right, several steps removed, that we're really dealing with the realm of art objects that are being collected as simulacra of traces of Michelangelo's, not necessarily hand, but his disegno interno, right? His conception of an idea. To turn the question another way, I find it quite remarkable what happened to both Michelangelo and Pontormo, not just Vittoria Colonna, because frankly we just don't know what her response would have been. She accepted the Pontormo copy, so we have to assume that she was pleased with it. But this collaboration between the two that then followed in a pagan vein, kind of a profane love to follow on the heels of a sacred love, it was really the beginning of the end. And speaking of Il Mano, Pontormo's hand in particular really fell still in one very interesting regard. That commission spelled the end of his, at least in terms of surviving works, of his altarpiece production. And he was only 37 when he began painting that Noli Tangere. So there's, of course, the San Lorenzo choir fresco that haunted him for the last decade of his life, his most grandiose commission that he never finished. But he never, at least as far as we know, and Vasari doesn't mention, as far as I know, any altarpieces that are no longer extant. But it's almost as if, to borrow Ovidian imagery, he was kind of an Icarus or a Phaeton who flew too close to the sun and was really overwhelmed, I think, in at least some sense, by working with Michelangelo, when really it was the cartoon, the invention that everyone writes about and talks about as almost a marvel in its own right, not necessarily the painting, which Vasari, by the way, calls perfect several times. He praises it very, very much. But it's really the kernel of the idea. And as I hope I demonstrated just how spectacularly original and unorthodox that solution was, a standing, striding Magdalene who's about to be touched on her breast by Christ himself.
Okay, there was a lot in that question, so I'll just try to touch upon a few things. I think one of the things I'm very interested in is the very fact that authentic and original does not mean, all of us here know that it doesn't mean the one thing, but sort of that attaching a name to something in a museum does now, or these kinds of things. And so I think precisely what I was trying to articulate a little bit in this is that because of her intimate relationship with Michelangelo, exactly that for her these drawings have to have the hand, but in these circles, as the ever sort of gradually increasing circles, can there still be a sense of it being simultaneously unoriginal and being acknowledged as sort of executed by someone else? And of course, we even have this question of, when he says the disegno is ruined, he doesn't want her interference, but we know with Cavalieri, he welcomes this kind of dialogue about the drawing. So their relationship is very particular, even within his own personal correspondence. And the question of originals, where we have three different fall of phaetons for Cavalieri, and so I feel like they're even more, not really answering, it's more just expounding upon this problem. And I think that just sort of the different ways in which something could be perceived as original. And I also just want to, add on something that makes it even more complex, is we tend to think that in some ways prints are talked about putting into stark contrast an original work of art, that the print sort of says, okay, well, I am a copy, and therefore these are all copies, and now we are even more aware of the singularity of the execution. But in early collecting, for example, is very interesting. A lot of collectors bound prints and drawings in the same books. Sometimes they were even talked about in the same way. The notion of the reproductive print didn't actually exist until later, and so sometimes prints were referred to as Michelangelo's, sometimes by the person who executed the print, and there's no sort of codification yet of that notion of authorship, which is something else that I find very interesting in talking about the prints after Michelangelo, and of course Colonna's printed versions of her texts, which seem to be codified in a certain way, according to certain standards, but then also open up multiple notions. So that just is expanding outward as opposed to answering in any way.
It also creates a network, though. I mean, these images where one owns a picture and is conscious that someone else owns a version variant by the same artist, by a different artist, but that are related, these create affective, powerful spiritual networks. And this is something that Titian does quite consciously with his pictures. And, you know, as you were walking us through the process, it seems like there's very clearly an idea of a kind of a network in which the uniqueness of each object is not what makes them powerful. What makes them powerful is precisely that there is a residue of a bond that is led, that these things become conduits for a kind of, and a making visible of allegiances and alliances and a shared spiritual purpose.
I have a quick question for Chris, but actually I might pick up on this theme of the vestigial sort of quality of things made by the hand. In fact, there was an article, I believe it was by Giorgio Mazzi, Veronica maybe you'll remember, on the matter of Michelangelo's proposed publication of his poetry. And in fact, his choice between manuscript and print as a possible means of dissemination. And the idea was raised, I believe it was by Mazzi, but that in fact it was the quality and the presence of Michelangelo's hand in a manuscript form that might have made it more attractive as a mode of disseminating in naturally a smaller circle this poetry. So perhaps related to what you're doing. But my question for Chris is simply this. One thing I found certainly in versions of the penitential psalms in the period, and the one by Aretino in particular that has been commented on quite extensively, is this idea that lust as a sin stood as a metonym for sin more broadly. Mm-hmm. And I wonder to what extent we might see that in the Magdalene, that in this very voluptuous form suggestive of lust and of sin, that, you know, the viewer is sort of invited to reflect on or transform, how much this might be a bit of a synecdoche,
Yeah, I mean, if anything, if lust is there, it's got to be something like that. But I'm not entirely sold that it's a picture that is predicated on lust, because, you know, I look at that face and I just see this, like, so if you look at, like, Titian's Bacchanal of the Andreas, right? You've got this woman in the lower right-hand corner, and she's nude, and she's thrusting her breasts forward and her hips, and, like, that is a body that is not sleeping. You know, that is, like, undergoing passion. And, you know, her face is actually somewhat similar to the Magdalene in the sense of this, like, just absorption and, like, carnal experience. But I don't necessarily think that, like, there's something going on below the lower boundary of the painting that we don't see. This is like the love of God fully overtaking the body and just like making the body tingle with divine presence. And so I think if anything, you know, it's like if the metonym is there, the metonym is then engaged to dismiss.
Exactly.
So it becomes a kind of like, and here's all possible bodily sin, we're going to embrace it, and then we're going to say, but the love of God is like, undoes all of that. And the body, when it is awakened to this divine presence, is sensitized in a way that has parallels with an erotic experience.
I see that journey encompassed in that image very much. Yeah. I mean, the focus is clearly on the spiritual experience. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
I can just really quickly jump in. Yeah. Just to take a very different tack, I was so struck in both of your talks by the imagery of the mirror, or the language of the mirror, because Jessica, you mentioned that Colonna used magnifying glasses, but also mirrors, which I found really interesting because that crucified Christ that we know quite well almost looks mirrored because it's not that often that you actually see him facing in that direction as well. But also with the Magdalene, that verse, when I mirror myself as a verb and back in the beautiful example and straighten and raise my soul, it's such a powerful, idea that in looking at that image, right, you actually see yourself and you meditate and you, whatever you have to do, repent or, contemplate on one's mortality or redemption or perseverance or, right? It's a very personal image in many ways.
I just wanted to say, at first, I don't think people should get too anxious about the timing, because I quite deliberately put in like 2 breaks this afternoon of half an hour each, because I thought just like some discussion is going to go on for too long, and we need to be able to painlessly recoup time. So I think we shouldn't truncate this if we don't want to. I thought this was a fantastic panel, and the papers all went wonderfully together. I had a kind of question or observation for Chris, which was, I think, I was talking yesterday in my opening remarks about like how different Colonna might look if we fully incorporate the literature of the sacred literature of the Counter-Reformation. And I'm kind of tempted to look back on the kind of painting and verse about Mary Magdalene in the 1530s and 40s from that kind of retrospective position, because later in the Counter-Reformation, the conversion of Mary Magdalene becomes, absolutely a key theme, and you get all these poems on the Lacrime di Maria Maddalena. And I think it's such a theme, partly because all those poets are hugely preoccupied with precisely conversion and conversion of the language of Petrarchism, which is all about celebrating this radiant, extraordinary physical beauty, into a kind of, new spiritual mode of literature. So that theme is embraced always in that kind of self-referential way that Cropper picks out so well within representations of beauty, both in verse and in painting. So I'm wondering whether, you absolutely, this is certainly true of this later Counter-Reformation poetry, you absolutely need the beauty and the sensuality to be in the painting for the conversion theme to be kind of fully triggered. And I also wonder whether, given that it's Titian and that he's such a pioneer of trying to incorporate poetry and narrative and temporality into paint, whether this is actually, intended to be a kind of narrative, that the allusions to her beauty are an allusion to her sensuality precisely when it's being redirected.
Yeah, I mean, so first in terms of the later stuff, I think as I move forward, this is something that I want to look more into. There is a distinction, though, about the moments that are picked up by, say, Caravaggio or Artemisia Gentileschi or any of the kind of painters of, the early Seicento, where they show her, at that moment. I rip off my necklace and I throw it down and my earrings are there. And, the Caravaggio is amazing because she cries her eyes out. And it's like, post-breakup, like snot coming out of your nose. And then you have that moment after you've cried it out and it's just the calm, right? And it's that moment after. And that's what the Seicento painters tend to show, is this moment when she has that realization, my life of sin is over and now I'm going to love God. And Titian, like, what's interesting, and we get back to the problem of metonyms and temporalities, that in some ways it wants to show that. And in another way, it shows her in penitence already. So she's withdrawn from life. She's out in the wilderness. She's got her little cave in the background. But as Titian says in that one letter, it's the first day, right? So it's like, it becomes this incredibly capacious picture that I think, there are multiple kind of lineages that come out of it. One of which is definitely a kind of, a conversion image. And what I was trying to just imagine and be really sensitive to is the fact that, like, this stands at the beginning of a tradition, actually probably multiple traditions. And so I think, it's absolutely there, even if in the later period it will be taken in a slightly more literal way as conversion. So I was trying to talk about conversion as the turn, right, rather than as the act of renunciation, which is what you'll get in a lot of the later stuff. So it's that, like, it's the affective turning of the soul. And so the body can absolutely, like, do that. And she's twisted out of alignment with the picture plane too.
Literature from the missing period, i.e. the 1560s to 1600, not really the full-on Baroque, which I think is something quite different. But also, I was thinking, why not the first day? I mean, that's exactly what Colonna's poem is talking about. She's talking about the journey to the place of penitence, and it is the first day, you know. It's like...
But the hair, right? She's been there a long time because of the hair. It's like Donatello's Magdalene. Right?
But she also dries Christ's hair with her feet, right? So she's got, like, long locks.
But she's drowning, literally.
She is.
It's creeping all around her body. It's taking over, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what you were alluding to toward the end about conversion, and you brought up the Bellini St. Francis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And about being washed in the light of God. I mean, she's incredibly, the lighting is very powerful. You mentioned the dark cave, and then, of course, this imagery of daybreak, which also reappears in the Noli me Tangere, the symbolism of the breast that is in both paintings and very powerfully evoked. And like you said, doesn't need to be read sort of dialectically as either one thing or the other, right? Because it's in this moment of purification that's incredibly intimate that's happening. But I would sort of resist this first day reading as a kind of tongue-in-cheek response, you know, who's a very witty guy in the studio, and think about whether there is anywhere in the penitential literature about her being made young, beautiful, whole again after a long time in the desert, simply because of that mass of hair. It's just an idea, but...
Could I just jump in just for 1 second? I have to admit that quip made me think of the Michelangelo exchange where someone comments that why, in the Pietà, why does the Virgin, look so young? And he purportedly quips, well, don't you know that, virgins never age, right? That's why she's so beautiful. So it feels like the exact same kind of genre of, so it's... But at the same time, there is a sort of theological justification for the Virgin remaining ever beautiful in Michelangelo's comment. And so, drawing on that, the same kind of thing. Can it be simultaneously the first day and after many days in this sort of rich, multi-temporal thing that painting can do? And what that might mean. But it did make me think very much of that exchange.
And while we're passing the microphone, I just say, just because it's a clever quip doesn't mean it doesn't have the serious theological valence, as with the Michelangelo, right? Like Titian can say it's the first day, but it can also be like a deeply, like, funny and yet deeply felt.
The image is so suggestive. I think so many perspectives are possible, but I think the idea of sublimation might capture all of these moments. The fact that the journey is evoked, I feel that very much, but that in fact her final state, which is very clearly in poems anyway, that juxtapose terrestrial love and love for God.
Great. I think maybe if we aim at 3/4 of an hour for lunch rather than a whole hour, and assemble back here at 1:15. No one's looking very convinced. Okay, we'll have an entire hour for lunch and then just truncate the afternoon breaks.